Not Quite Right features discussions that are unfiltered and uncensored and may include themes that are inappropriate for younger listeners. Also, I swear a lot.
Something doesn't seem quite right.
Welcome to Not Quite Right. My name's Ed.
And I'm Amanda.
This is the fourth of our October 2024 Daredevil episodes. So Daredevils are people who have volunteered on purpose for the privilege of having their stories read out and being lambasted on the podcast.
Brave, bold, crazy choice.
As a reminder, this is the October 2024 round of the Not Quite Right prize, and the three prompts for this round were the word prompt palm, the action prompt of telling a lie, and the anti-prompt of break the rule, avoid head hopping. And our lamb to the slaughter this episode is Christy Hartman with her story Home Sweet Home.
So Christy's participated in the Not Quite Right prize before and has consistently hit that maybe level. So I think this episode will be interesting for those of you who are trying to crack that long list, not necessarily knowing exactly what it is that stands between you and that place on the long list. Because sometimes it's not much that's getting in the way. And when we are considering those maybes, it's always a case of which maybes end up. Like, you know, it's not all sort of slam dunks to the long list. There's a section of stories that are slam dunks onto the long list, and then there's this whole other collection of stories that are just at varying degrees of maybe. And so it is that delicate mix of things that might get you there or not. So I think this will be a particularly interesting one from that perspective.
So here is Home Sweet Home by Christy Hartman. The flickering television casts midnight shadows across my wainscoting. I squeeze my disintegrating insulation, desperate to make my walls thin enough for Paul to hear Cheryl's sobs. He sighs, turns off the TV, and stares at my popcorn ceiling. Exhausted from arguing, Cheryl collapses onto their bed, arms wrapped around her knees, protecting her soft spots like a wounded animal. Tonight's fight had been the worst since they'd moved in a year ago. Angry words had ricocheted off my walls, spiralling dust motes through the tension-thick air. "You would have guilted me into not going," Paul shouted. "I shouldn't have to guilt-trip you to come home to us. It was one dinner," he spat back. "I haven't seen the guys in months." "Then why lie? You weren't working late," Cheryl said. "Because you always overreact," he replied, "and I always do the wrong thing. The baby's only 3 months old. I'd love a night out." Cheryl sucked in a breath. "Fuck you." Now Hannah sleeps peacefully in her crib, an oblivious boy floating between her dad's stubborn moping in the living room and her mum's seething resentment in the master bedroom. One tiny palm reaches through the bars to rest on my corn silk yellow wall. My last girl had painted this room purple, covering me with posters of rock bands and photos of friends. I ache to once again overflow with toddler giggles and childhood games. I crank up the nursery heat before releasing an icy draft through my window panes and under the front door. Paul shivers on the couch, pulling the throw to his chin. His sprawled frame is a sharp contrast to Cheryl's curled-up body in their bedroom. Paul's confusion and embarrassment swirl up to my exposed beams, while his regret presses into the hardwood, along with the feet of their new sofa. The chill sends Paul shuffling to the bedroom. I tighten the hallway floor joists and still the air. He passes the nursery without a squeak. "Can I join you?" His hand rests on the door frame. I feel his racing pulse through the oak. It's your bed too, Cheryl whispers. Paul slips under the duvet. Miles of cotton lie between their stiff backs. I loosen the nail holding their wedding portrait above the bed. It clatters onto the headboard. The glass spider webs, but holds together. Cheryl turns on the bedside lamp and clutches the picture. She wonders if it's worth fixing. I'll get a new frame tomorrow. Paul reaches a tentative toe across the sheet, sliding it along her foot. Relief floods from the tip of my eaves to the depths of my musty crawl space. My old bones groan and creak as she rolls toward him. I'm sorry. His heart rate slows. Next Friday's your turn. I'll call the girls tomorrow. Cheryl snuggles closer. And I'm sorry too. Soft lips and sighs muffle their I love yous. The baby stirs. I stretch and contract the floorboards under the crib, rocking her back to sleep. So thanks, Christy, for your story. Christy didn't leave us with a voicemail or a brief description, so we'll have to make assumptions about her intentions with the story. This was a really interesting one because the house is the perspective character, and we didn't expect that, and we didn't see that from anyone else in this round of the comp.
No, and we did get some other inanimate objects that were made animate, right? And so that idea was captured by a few different authors. But what I think I really liked about this take was the idea of how the house could, in each of its rooms, have different parts of the scene happening. So one of the issues with head hopping, or one of the reasons I suppose head hopping occurs in stories, is because authors are trying to show things happening that the perspective character is not there to witness. And so they have to head hop to get someone else's perspective because the main character is not there. And so I thought that was a really interesting idea. Like, how can I show actually different scenes taking place while maintaining a unified perspective?
Yeah.
So that was super clever and a really unique way of approaching the head-hopping anti-prompt.
And it went beyond that too, because the house wasn't just a impartial bystander. The house had agency in the situation, right? It had a history, and it spoke about previous occupants of the house, and it was driven to create some sort of harmony in this household. It wanted the people who lived there to be happy. Yeah,
it was a character in its own right, as well as having this perspective.
So the first line: the flickering television casts midnight shadows across my wainscoting. I squeeze my disintegrated insulation, desperate to make my walls thin enough for Paul to hear Cheryl's sobs. I think that sets the scene quite well. On first reading of this story, it did take me a couple of beats to figure out who the perspective character is here. I mean, it comes through in the story fairly quickly.
I think that whole opening paragraph, all of it together, I guess it's a lot to fit in one sentence, right? A lot of explanation of we're getting the perspective of a house without actually just stating that outright, which you don't want to do. So I think those sentences work together, and they do set up a question, right? What do you mean across your wainscoting? What do you mean? And it's very soon after we understand that it's the house giving its perspective, because it goes on to describe the various different component parts of itself that it's manipulating. And I think that's quite clever.
Yeah.
I do think maybe there could have been a little bit of tweaking done to maybe improve the flow of that so that we're not stuck on that first sentence. But without going into deep thought on it, I can't suggest an obvious alternative. It's a tricky thing to do.
It is.
And I think Christy's done it just fine here. But, you can always work towards improving that flow and getting rid of any little stumbling blocks that you have. And those little stumbling blocks, they may be minor, but at the same time, they do take you out of that story for a second, and you just want to always have your readers immersed in the story as much as possible.
Yeah, and you can consider options like adding like a sentence before this of just trying to establish that perspective a little bit more firmly. But it is a trade-off because what I think Christy does really well is really quickly introduce these other characters who, even though they're not the perspective character, Paul and Cheryl, this story is about them. And that's in the second sentence that we are introduced to Paul and Cheryl and the fact that there's sobbing and
there's
and
conflict. Yeah, so there's a lot being done here. So look, sort of what I'm suggesting here is nitpicks. I think it is tweaking and finessing as opposed to like any sort of major change that I would suggest. I think Christy's done a fine job of introducing the story.
Yeah, and it is fairly clear, like he sighs, turns off the TV and stares at my popcorn ceiling.
Yeah.
You either think that it's the house or you think that there's some random other character in the room like who owns the popcorn ceiling specifically. So it's fairly clear from that context.
I just have to raise a question, and perhaps it's my ignorance or maybe just an Aussie thing, but the ceiling's later described as having exposed beams. So when I think of popcorn ceiling, in my experience as an Aussie, popcorn ceiling's usually what you would find in an apartment or a flat, and it's the ceiling to basically soundproof between you and the floor above. And so in a home, and it seems to me like this is a house as opposed to an apartment or a flat, I'm not sure I'm used to the idea of having popcorn ceiling, especially with also having exposed beams. Those two things don't work for me. So I'm not sure if that's an oversight or if that's me not being familiar with it. Maybe it's insulation from the cold or something that is in other countries that I'm not aware of.
Yeah, the exposed beams, I admit at some point I did kind of stop and think about that a little bit, like how does that all work? I guess I can conceptualize a room that has both popcorn ceilings and exposed beams, like that's possible, but it's also unlikely. And again, this is not important, right, from the perspective of storytelling, but it is the kind of thing that you should just consider that your reader will think about, because what you're doing is setting the scene up for your reader to picture in their mind, right? They're picturing a room with popcorn ceilings and then you're saying exposed beams, and it's a little bit of a thought process for them to like marry those two up, and how does that all fit?
Absolutely.
And then we get into the fight, the argument, right? So straight away there's sobs, and exhausted from arguing, Cheryl collapses into their bed, arms wrapped around her knees. And we have the context of this fight that's thrown out. And it's a fairly, like, recognizable argument. Like, he's going out and having fun.
And lying about it.
And she's at home looking after the baby. And there's that kind of standard conflict that a lot of couples have. So what you've done well there is leverage a common experience and something that people can recognize easily.
What I would question is the choice to describe Cheryl as protecting her soft spots like a wounded animal, because that to me implies there's been violence, and I don't really feel like that's what's actually happening in this particular story, because they resolve it very quickly without any reference to that, and certainly no overt or direct reference to violence. And you can sort of curl up, and I understand that that's what you're saying, but I think maybe it's making an implication that's not really appropriate, because if there was violence, for example, I as a reader would not be cheering for them to get back together. So I'm not saying that's what you've said, but it's kind of implied there, and I feel like maybe that's a little bit of a problem, because it introduces kind of another element there of character potentially that you don't really want.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I have to say that line also stood out to me for a different reason. It's the visual of protecting the soft spots like a wounded animal. But I thought it was good from the perspective of a house, because a house is made of all these hard things, right? And it might see its occupants as soft and vulnerable and like
animals.
Yeah, and it might actually have that perspective, whether or not there is violence, that these are just these soft and creatures that live and die inside it. And it is a good use of that perspective, but I do agree that it kind of complicates and confounds the situation.
Yeah, I mean, you could still use that approach of seeing the humans as these kind of soft, weak creatures, but without that layer to it.
Yeah. The next line, tonight's fight had been the worst since they'd moved in a year ago. Angry words had ricocheted off my walls, spiralling dust motes through the tension-thick air.
Okay, I'm going to reveal my ignorance here, because I'm not great with grammar, right? Like I have an innate sense of grammar, but I wasn't taught properly at school, so I don't know the names for things. But What I would say is, what I would recommend usually is using simple past tense. And I don't know what we call this, had been, but it's not simple past tense. Do you
No,
know
it's
what
perfect past tense.
Okay. The reason I draw attention to it is because I think sometimes that simpler approach can be a little bit less distracting. Again, it's like taking out that little bump for the reader and just improving the reading flow. This is just a personal opinion. I'm not saying it's never appropriate, but I think in these sentences, it would have been more appropriate to stick with something a little more simple. So we've got, tonight's fight had been the worst since they'd moved in a year ago. Angry words had ricocheted off my walls. And I feel like tonight's fight was the worst since they'd moved in a year ago. Angry words ricocheted off my walls. Like, to me, that reads a little bit more smoothly, fewer syllables. Like, it's silly, but it can just improve the rhythm of what you're reading as well. And sometimes you want to throw that had in there because you're trying to play with the rhythm in other ways. But I think here the simpler approach would have flowed a little bit better.
And like that hadn't occurred to me, but I think you're right about that. It just makes it a little bit more direct.
Yeah, just smoothing that road a little bit. It's such a subtle thing. I don't want to overblow it, but I do tend to recommend this to people unless you've got a good reason not to. Just writing in simple past tense is probably usually the best choice for storytelling.
Yeah, and being consistent about it. Like, if you're going to choose one, then stick to it.
And we've got then, this is going to be nitpicks because honestly, like, this is a fabulous story. I think just some other little subtle tweaks, and this is what we're talking here. Sometimes that's the difference, right? These subtle tweaks that you can make. And we've got, it was one dinner, he spat back, I haven't seen the guys in months. Then why lie, you weren't working late, Cheryl said. And I'm not sure we need those dialogue tags. So I would be suggesting editing them out. It is clear here that he speaks, then she speaks, then he speaks, then she speaks. I would potentially either replace them with an action beat or just get rid of them altogether because, again, we're just trying to smooth it out. We're trying to get rid of anything that's sort of taking us out of the story. And injecting these he spat back, she said, it's sort of taking us out of hearing that now. Like, we're not in the scene hearing it. We're being told that that's what's being said.
Yeah, you can save some words there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, with dialogue always, as writers, we should be working towards writing dialogue which you don't even need a dialogue tag because it's evident who's speaking from what they're saying and the way they're saying it. And I think actually Christy's done that really well. I think it's very evident who's speaking and what their perspective is. And I don't think we need those additional dialogue tags.
All right, so the next line, now Hannah sleeps peacefully in her crib, an oblivious boy floating between her dad's stubborn moping in the living room and her mum's seething resentment in the master bedroom. Well, just a note here, boy there is the floating thing in the ocean that Americans and Canadians would call a buoy, but we call a boy here in Australia. What did you think of that line?
Look, I liked the idea, this metaphor of a boy floating in the ocean. I think it would have been nice to see that metaphor through. So we've sort of got that. We've dropped that in. She's like an oblivious boy floating between them, but they're not part of that metaphor. In what ways could they be reflected in?
Yeah, follow through on the metaphor, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And you know what, like, to go deeper a level again, as much as I like that metaphor, I'm not sure it is the best choice of metaphor. I think you can always challenge yourself to look at something that's more appropriate in the setting. Like, is a house perceiving something as a boy in the ocean? What would a house know of a boy in the ocean? Think about a metaphor a house might make and complete that metaphor, include the parents in that metaphor and really deliver like a visual to us of the three of them and what that might look like from the perspective of this house.
Yeah. One thing that always stands out to me in reading and critiquing stories is telling rather than showing, right? And this sentence has it. The dad's stubborn moping in the living room, mum's seething resentment in the master bedroom. So you're spelling out here what the emotions are that these two people are feeling. And I don't think you need to do that because you've just created the
it's all
scene,
set up.
Right?
Yeah, we know that.
You've shown us and now you're telling us. And I think you don't need to do that, right? And you're introducing Hannah in her crib. And, do you need to do that or do you not need to do that? I don't know if it's necessary to introduce Hannah as another character. We know that she's in the house already from the dialogue, right? And I'm not sure that she really plays a big role.
Yeah, she's an oblivious boy, right? She's not playing an active role. And look, I think her presence is warranted, that she's part of that argument. She's a key part of that argument and why this conflict is existing between them. And maybe that's where we're saying like completing that metaphor might help. let's understand what is her role in this relationship between them and how does that feed into this particular scene.
Yeah, but what I did find interesting is what comes after that is my last girl had painted this room purple. And that was an interesting detail of the house having a memory of the previous family. And I would have liked more of that, I think.
Yeah.
Because it's a kind of a one-off mention, hey, this used to be purple. That gives us a little bit more about the character of the house.
Yeah.
But maybe there was more history there. Maybe the house has seen this kind of thing before and maybe it played out differently in the past and it's trying to prevent that from happening. I would have liked to know more about that.
I fully agree with you. And I think if we just take a step back and look at this from a bigger picture level, one thing that I wanted to see that I don't feel like I got a handle on was the house. It's going to sound completely stupid, but the house's motivations here. So we know that the house wants them to be, we want a happy home, right? We want people to be not in conflict. We want them to be peaceful. But why? So what you've just suggested is that's this little bit of backstory. It's starting to touch on that. Like, what does this house want? Like, what's its story? And we've touched on it here, but it hasn't quite connected the dots of, okay, like that's your history and you liked that and you'd like some happy toddler sounds again, but why? What are the stakes for the house? I think that's a missing puzzle piece.
And there is a mention given here of, I ache to once again overflow with toddler giggles and childhood games. But, that's probably going to happen given that you've got a baby in the house.
So like maybe introducing this is just a suggestion. It could be many things. But if part of that backstory is that the previous family broke up and that we've got this teenager introduced, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that teenager became sullen and withdrawn because the family broke up and they were, it became a bit somber and sad, and the house is trying to avoid that happening again. Like the house had this happy memory of this happy home with the toddler playing and a happy family, and then that all fell apart and the house is desperately trying to cling to the happy.
Yeah.
I think that's all you sort of needed, like just that connecting of the dots of what's happened before and how is that impacting what's happening now and the house's motivation here in keeping a happy home.
And that's difficult to portray, I think, again, from the perspective of a house. And you don't want to just have exposition saying, oh, well, once 20 years ago, there was another family and blah, blah, blah. But you've actually latched onto the way of doing that. And that's through these details of before there was another room that was painted purple. And it doesn't have to be much, just a little reference that helps us piece together like what that backstory is. And actually, this is maybe a side point, but while you were talking, it occurred to me this idea of a house having a perspective and a consciousness and an agency is not completely new, right? We've seen it's almost a trope, but it's always like a killer house.
Yeah.
It's in a horror movie. The house is trying to kill everyone who lives in the house because it's been tainted by a demon or whatever. That's like a horror movie trope. And this is the opposite of that. So I think that's really interesting.
No, I totally agree. The whole concept here is really appealing and really sweet. And I really like what's going on. And I think that's why, I really want to know those extra pieces to just really deliver that impactful emotional message, because it's there. It's all there. It just needs to be woven through with just a little bit more information.
Yeah. So the next paragraph, I crank up the nursery heat before releasing an icy draft through my window panes and under the front door. Paul shivers on the couch, pulling the throw up to his chin. So we have this scene where Paul is, there's been this fight. Cheryl is upstairs in the bedroom. Paul is sleeping on the couch. And the house exhibits this agency to try and get them back together, releasing an icy draft. And I thought this was really good because we talk about stories where the conclusion doesn't really flow from what happens in the story, and there's a change of heart that, is not backed up by what's just taken place in the story. This is one where I feel it is. And because we know couples have arguments and then it calms down and they're looking for an excuse to reconcile. And the house has just provided this little excuse to reconcile. That was quite sweet and that was quite powerful that he got a bit cold and that's all he needed. to kind of come back.
I agree. I think that's really nice and fits. Like, it just makes sense, right? Like, you read that and you're like, yep, that's exactly what the house would do in that situation, you know? I think my challenge on that paragraph would be more around that show don't tell kind of thing. So, I mean, I like that we're contrasting his sprawled frame to her curled up body. Like, what does that say about the two characters there? But then we say Paul's confusion and embarrassment swirl up to my exposed beams while his regret presses into the hardwood.
Yeah.
And I would have loved to have seen some of those emotions play out more in his actions rather than just stating outright he's confused and embarrassed. What can he be doing to show that?
That line stood out to me as well because it's not only the telling aspect, but, you know, you're creating this visual of Paul's confusion and embarrassment swirling up to my exposed beams. Like, what does that look like? What exactly am I visualizing? So I do like that idea, but I think, you know, we should see those emotions play out rather than have them told to us.
And look, I think we do. Like, when he's sort of sheepishly shuffling back to the bedroom, we can see that he's regretful in their dialogue. We don't need necessarily to be told how he's feeling. We just need to see what he does and how he acts. As an example, right, if he's tossing and turning in that blanket, well, what does that show us? It shows us he's like really struggling with something, right, emotionally. Well, that's what's implied. So that kind of action can be used instead. You know, he's tossing and turning, and then the house's perspective on that, it's maybe putting pressure on the floor, like, or whatever it might be that's happening, or maybe he's shuffling up against the wall and he can't settle, whatever that is from the house's perspective. But at the same time, like, we get a true sense of what his emotions are in that time.
Look, I think you're right, because as well in the next sequence where we see Paul shuffling back to the bedroom, you're already giving us his emotion here. So I would say there, like, trust in yourself that you're doing that without having to explain the emotions that come along with it.
Yeah, I think so. I'll say too that the dialogue between them feels really natural. Yeah. Like, it feels like a real fight. It feels like a real makeup. And I think that's really important, because when you're trying to get emotional resonance out of a scene, it needs to feel realistic. Yeah. And so that's something I think Christy has done really well.
Yeah. So they come back and they reconcile in bed. You know, once again, we do get a little bit of telling again. Relief floods from the tip of my eaves to the depths of my musty crawl space. My old bones groan and creak as she rolls towards him. We know that the house has engineered this situation. Maybe the house can just, like, relax.
Yeah, and what does the house relaxing sound like or look like or feel like to the house?
The final line, the baby stirs. I stretch and contract the floorboards under the crib, rocking her back to sleep. I think that's a perfect ending. Yeah. Because that's the house again, realising the situation has been diffused, and now, okay, I'm just going to rock the baby. Yep. That perfectly expresses the emotions of the house without needing to say, well, now the house is happy again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a really good example, if we're looking at this show don't tell thing, because look, all authors are constantly grappling with this idea of show don't tell. Like, it feels like a basic piece of advice because you hear it right at the start when you're starting writing, but then you hear it constantly forever because it's not actually basic. It's something that on one level it's basic, but it can actually become quite an advanced skill as well. And we can slip into that trap, and it needs to be done sometimes. Like, we talk about stories that are confusing. This story's not confusing. And so sometimes that telling can help remove confusion. But at the same time, it can also distance us from the story a little bit and from the action. So I'm just going to use an example, I think, to go through it. And the example is this photo, okay? So the house loosens the nail holding their wedding portrait. It clatters onto the headboard. The glass spiderwebs but holds together, that's showing to me. The glass spiderwebs but holds together. Okay, so we've had some damage, but we're holding together. We can reflect on how that might apply to the couple as well and their relationship. And then we have Cheryl's reaction. Cheryl turns on the bedside lamp and clutches the picture. She wonders if it's worth fixing. Now, that line at the end there, she wonders if it's worth fixing, is again great because there's a little bit of subtext there. Yeah. Why would it not be worth fixing? Well, if she doesn't really care about that photo anymore. And so she's not just wondering whether the photo frame is worth fixing. She's also wondering whether the relationship is worth fixing. Like, we can take all that from it. So that's great use of subtext. Those things are really good. But I think we can take it another level again, because we've said very directly, she wonders if it's worth fixing. Can we show that? How might she behave in that moment that reveals to us as readers that she's wondering if she should bother fixing it? I don't know if you have any suggestions. Like, it's tough. This is a tough.
It's tough. I mean, you can do it through dialogue, right, or action.
Yeah. So an example of dialogue might be Paul says, "I'll fix it in the morning," and Cheryl says, "Don't bother."
Yeah.
Like, what would that mean? We can take some implications from that. Perhaps she tries to fix it and makes it worse, you know.
Yeah.
There's different ways you can play with the action and the dialogue there to sort of reflect what's happening without maybe quite so directly stating it. Keeping that subtext of the framed photo representing their relationship, keep that there, but reveal it more in that dialogue and action rather than just stating it outright.
Well, that's a hard one. And I would say, like, I don't mind that little bit of telling with the subtext involved every now and again.
I guess this is where I'm saying, like, I think Christy's done a good job, right? I think that is good subtext there, but I think there's another level again.
Yeah.
And we're talking about going from a maybe to a yes onto the long list. And I think these tweaks are things that can help you get there.
Yeah.
So it sounds a bit crazy that I would suggest to you that you might obscure something a bit more. You know, usually we're trying to say, make it more clear, we need more explanation. Right now I'm saying hide something a little bit.
Yeah.
The reason I'm saying that is because it can, when it's done well, create a more satisfying reading experience.
Yeah.
If I get to figure that out. Like, if I were watching a movie, I would be getting what these characters are saying and what they're doing.
Yeah.
I would, depending on the movie, but usually not be getting narration to go with it of Cheryl wonders if it's worth fixing. You wouldn't get that in a movie, right? How can we show that on the stage, on the screen, you know, in a way that makes me see that and interpret that without needing the narrator? Because it's the narrator that's sort of distancing us from.
Yeah, you're right. And it feels fairly reductive to describe writing in that way of, like, you're trying to make a movie play in the mind of the reader because it's a different art form, right, than a movie. But it's very true. I think of writing as not just a movie. Like, the experience you're trying to replicate is of a person observing another person. Like, it's a voyeuristic thing almost. You want to look at a scene and see how that scene plays out. And you don't get the internals of what people are thinking. You need to express that through their action. But people are very capable. Like, if you watch two people interact, you can work out what they're thinking.
Yeah.
Right? You can work out what they're feeling, what they want to get out of the interaction. As a person, you are completely capable of doing that. So what you're doing in a story is trying to give the reader enough information that they can do that same process.
And it's about immersion too, right? Because you want the reader to feel so immersed in the story, it's like they were there.
Yeah.
And these are the ways that you can achieve that.
Yeah.
Whereas whenever you're describing something more as an author, when that authorial voice is coming in, that's when we start to create distance, which in itself can be its own technique. But I think in this case, immersion would have been, you know, the better choice. So it's very finicky stuff that we're talking here. But you've come to this Daredevil episode hoping to, I guess, get some ideas for how to improve. And that's a suggestion. You can clearly do it because I'm seeing it's happening in this story.
Yeah.
So it's just like doing it as much as you can, basically.
Yeah, like I said earlier, those moments of telling really stand out to me. I would like that to stand out to you as well. So that when you edit your story, when you're revising your story, you can say, well, how can I better phrase this, or how can I better portray this moment that I'm trying to portray, and not just tell you the emotion, but make you feel that emotion.
I think something I'm realising about stories, because we've had a few poets sneak onto the shortlist now, right? And I think I have to apologise to all the poets because I've said in the past, you know, I don't want to see poetry. I don't think it works in flash fiction. And look, I'm wrong. Up to a point, right?
Yeah.
What I think maybe we're looking for is not poetry as such, but like this lyrical quality to writing, this poetic type of quality to the writing. And I think we have that on one end of the scale. And I think on the other end of the scale, we have clarity. So something being clear versus something being beautiful. And I feel like that's a balance. And some stories tip more into that poetic, beautiful language at the expense of clarity. And some stories are very clear and very direct and maybe lack some of that beautiful language, but nevertheless can deliver like a compelling story because it's all there on the page for you. And what I'm suggesting maybe in this story is maybe tipping that balance a little bit more to the poetic or the lyrical and giving us a little bit more under the surface, giving us a little bit more metaphor, playing with language a bit to create a mood and to evoke some emotion and not just that direct exposition of exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think every story would have its own balance. But I think maybe that's one way of thinking about it. Like, what balance am I trying to achieve here? What balance serves this story? And yeah, I think maybe in this case, just a little bit more metaphor, a little bit more subtext would maybe evoke more emotion.
Yeah. So what's interesting to me about this story is that the characters are quite general, right? They're generalized. We don't know anything about Cheryl and Paul except that they're a couple with a baby. So there's not really a lot specific in this relationship. And what that indicates to me is that the story is not really about them. It's about the house, you know, in this situation. So again, coming back to that idea of like, give us more of that part of it, because that's where the specificity is, right? In the house and not so much in the couple. And I just wanted to point that out because it was interesting to me that I guess the lack of specificity about the couple themselves wasn't a problem for me in the story.
You don't miss it, do you? Because like you say, it's not what it's about.
Yeah.
It's about the house and the house's own experience of what's happening here. And the house isn't necessarily investing at that level in what's going on. It just wants harmony.
Yeah, the house doesn't know about like different kinds of couples and the house doesn't care about what they do for a living, you know, that kind of thing. So
yeah, it's not important to the story, and that's detail we don't need.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think one thing then, if we're talking about this as the house's story, then the concepts around character development and story development apply to the house, right? So it would be good to get a little bit more of the house's motivations, like why is it doing? We've talked about that. Why is it doing these things to get harmony? But another thing I think from a plot perspective, if we look at the house as the main character, I think it's interesting and potentially problematic that the house meets no resistance. Like there's conflict in this story because there's an argument happening between this couple, but there's no resistance to them getting back together. They just do. The house aids that, right? The house provides the cold breeze and smooths things over with the baby so the baby's not disturbed. But the house does that. It meets no resistance. The couple get back together. There's no resistance. It's like, can I hop into bed? Yep.
Yeah, that is true.
The conflict's over. And look, not every story necessarily needs to lean into that conflict, but I guess it's just interesting to me that the conflict was there, but it wasn't actually central to the narrative arc, I guess, of this scene. And I think maybe having more direct conflict and direct challenge to the house's goal. What are the stakes for the house if this couple don't reconcile? And when we understand that, well, let's see the house kind of struggle to get what it wants.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
weird as it is to say, like, I think that's the key to it, right? We don't necessarily need to see that couple struggling for their sake. We want to see them struggling, like, for the house's sake.
Exactly. So that's just something from a plot perspective to consider. I think these things are like those basic elements that we would always come back to. Do you have character? Do you have conflict? Do you have motivations and stakes? Like, these are core elements of your classic story structure. And I think then with all of those things in play, that ending would hit harder. Like it would feel more emotionally resonant. We've got the baby sleeping, we've got harmony now. It would feel like more of a yes, like the house got what it wanted, you know?
Yeah.
Which of course it does, but I think it would hit that bit harder if the house had to fight for it, basically.
Yeah. So let's talk about the prompts, and I guess like the big one here is the head-hopping anti-prompt, and like we've talked about it. The house is the perspective character. You've done it. Like, that's basically it.
A fabulous take on the anti-prompt. And I think too, the lie here, it's a real classic lie, like lying about working late. That was a good choice, and they both worked hand in hand here to deliver a plot. And so great choice on both counts. The palm prompt, it's the baby. So the baby putting its palm on the wall. And that was nice too because it's a little moment of the baby connecting with the house and drawing, I guess, attention to that. So all of those things were well handled.
Yeah.
So I think what's really great here is like we're getting into the weeds, and I often find like when we're doing critiques and so on, when I've got a lot to say, it's usually because the story's really good.
Yeah.
You know, because if the story's terrible, it's like, where do I start? You know? Yeah. But if the story is really great already, we're starting to try and tweak all of those tiny little things to make sure that they're doing as much as they can. And this is what we're saying, like the difference between a maybe for the long list and being on the long list is some of these things getting smoothed out, some of these things getting leveled up, and with maybe a few of those in play, you're there.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think there's a huge gap between this story and other stories that made the long list. It's not like there's glaring quality issues or anything like that. This is great writing. It's a great idea, great story. And so it just becomes about like, how do you stand out above another story?
Yeah. How do you elevate? Like this story we spoke about on the long list episode about surprise being a huge element of what makes you stand out. And this story had the surprise element and it has the uniqueness element. And you've got our attention here. And I think it really is about making those little tweaks. That's 90% of it. Like if you look at our spreadsheet of long list maybes, like there are a lot of maybes. So it doesn't take much to elevate yourself above the rest of the pack.
But by the same token, it doesn't take much to miss out, right? Yeah. And sometimes it is just the luck of the draw. Like for whatever reason, your story didn't or did, you know, resonate on that particular day with both of us. And so you're playing the odds as well. Yeah. You know, you're playing that game of luck. And you're also playing that game of like subjectivity, basically, because all of the stories have strengths, all the stories have weaknesses, all the stories have things they could do differently or better from our perspective, right? And then from the perspective of anyone else would be very different. And for us weighing up those things, it's impossible. You're comparing apples and oranges, like you just can't. And so it becomes about these little things. And that's, I guess, where your attention needs to go if you want to make the long list and go again, if you want to make the short list and win. Like it becomes about these little details.
So thanks, Christy, for sharing your story with us and taking the plunge of being a daredevil. We know it's nerve-wracking, but look, we really liked your story and you should be proud of this story, and thank you for sharing it with us.
Yeah, and I would say on behalf of the listeners as well, thank you, because I think these daredevils are doing a public service, right? You're putting yourself out there, but we're all learning, you know, from your pain. So thank you on behalf of the listeners.
Yeah, and we'll be back next week with our fifth and final daredevil of this round. So until then, ride on.
Ride on.
We hope you enjoyed this special Daredevil episode of Not Quite Right. If you have thoughts on this story, follow us on social media and join the conversation. And if you'd like to participate in the next round of the competition, head over to our website at notquiteright.com. That's WRITE.
Something doesn't seem quite